Our guest today is Dr. Seth Perry. Dr. Perry, welcome to It's Useful to Know.
Thanks.
Can you tell me something from your field that you think it would be useful for people to know?
So, in my corner of the field of early American religious history, I think a lot about the founding era, so the Revolutionary period and the early national period. Um, and there's a lot of talk about that time period in sort of the public sphere around what we would call like Christian nationalism. So the idea that founding, that Christianity and the Christianness of the players in that time period is a constitutive, important, key cornerstone of what America is. And my work in the sources of that time period just shows that there's no singular Christianity in that moment. There's a lot of religious diversity. You would say inter and intra-religious diversity in the sense of there are African religions present among the enslaved and the free black population. Native American religions, those voices aren't heard as clearly in the sources, and that's a lot of great work in scholarship is working to change that. But that diversity is there. Those are the Americans of the American founding. The people who would call themselves Christians don't always mean the same, rarely mean the same thing when they talk about what Christian is, right? So to say that like a Christianity, right, is the sort of a core of the founding, really obscures a lot of the actual history. And it's just really clear to me that when people ask that question or think in terms of Christian nationalism today, they're not really asking about the past. They're asking something they want to be true about the present. So there's a lot of Christian nationalist imagery in and around the January 6th insurrection. And those people who sort of wrap themselves in a notional like revolutionary Christianity are misrepresenting and misunderstanding what the founding actually is, and what Christianity would have meant to the diverse players in that moment for the sake of their own kind of current political interests. So actually, yeah, an example from that I've come across in research. In 1803, I meant to double check that date, 1803 or two, in the election for the House chaplain. So people would point to this and say, well, we've always had Christian clergy in the House, but the members of Congress who were voting for that person in that election, I think the winner ends up being a Congregationalist minister, which would be pretty standard for that type of an election at that moment. Um, but the other people who got votes include Lorenzo Dow, who is the most famous itinerant preacher in the early 19th century. I'm writing a book about him. And he gets 2 votes. He's a very different figure than the Congregationalist who won, right? Theologically, he's very much against what they represent, and in terms of style, he's very different. So there's just like a completely different notion of what the chaplain might look like. And then the other person who got a vote in that election from a member of the House of Representatives had voted for Thomas Paine to be the House of Representative chaplain. Of course, that person is kind of joking because it's not going to happen. But what makes it pointed is that Thomas Paine, by this moment, was known as the author of The Age of Reason, which is this broadside against the sanctity of the Bible, the notion of revealed religion at all, in the 1790s. So someone who had been elected to Congress, and I have not been able to identify, match up the vote with someone, but someone like did not endorse this notion of a Christian, presence here, because Paine is definitely not a Christian. And so to think back on that era and just look at that type of diversity, even just there among elected officials, militates against any notion of a standard kind of Christian national ideal.
Thomas Paine is also a great example to bring up in this case because he was so important to the American Revolution. And so the idea of the American nation and the American founding, to talk about it without Thomas Paine, he's a major figure too.
And someone like Benjamin Franklin, who's a free thinker who nevertheless donated to a lot of local churches. So he would donate to lots of, but would never have been, called himself a Christian. Someone like Thomas Jefferson, who gets conscripted into different forms of Christian nationalism because he did think a lot about the words of Jesus, for example, but famously he went through the Bible and cut out the miracles. And so all of these people kind of get conscripted, brought into a kind of Christian nationalist form. very much in a direct sort of contradiction of the historical record.
Two parts that you're raising is that there's the sense of the American nation, American citizen as being a Christian, and that is what the shape of the average person is across history in the US, but then also this commitment to founding fathers as creating a Christian nation by our legal structure and in our Constitution. And so you're pointing out that both of those things were actually much more complicated and much more diverse. Can you tell me a little bit about how your scholarship now is looking at these types of questions?
And what I'm really interested in with him and some other figures from this period is the way that they sort of self-narrate their religious experience, their religiosity, and it's in that narration that they create that identity, right? And I have a more complicated argument about that, but the way that I think this interfaces with these questions about like the character of the nation, like that founding nation, is that just as these individuals on individual levels tell the story of themselves, and in doing that they create that self, the nation does that too, right? And the nation is sort of what we is the thing that we talk about it being, right? And the in that founding moment in the early national period, that story that is happening all the time. Like Americans are in the process of telling themselves who they are, and there isn't just one voice. There are lots of different versions of what that is, different political parties and different like ways of thinking about the legacy. And you can talk about the legacy of the founding, like the day after the day after the Constitution is ratified, you start talking about what it means, right? Who we are. The thing that makes me proud as an American is that diversity is what our nation comes from, right? The process of working out the terms of equality and the terms of what the First Amendment's religious clauses mean, right? That process is ongoing and has not always been pretty and has not always tended toward justice, but that process is possible, right? Our assumptions, the assumptions that come from that founding era, make that process that we're still in possible, and I think that's something for Americans of all political persuasions to get behind, right? That recognition.